The morning mist clung to the air like memory, silent, stubborn, refusing to lift. Ellie Carter stood at the kitchen window, her hand wrapped loosely around a chipped white mug, steam curling upward but failing to warm the chill in her fingers. Outside, the world wore a soft gray shroud. Pines disappeared into fog, and the dirt path leading from her porch faded like a half-remembered dream. She hadn't stepped off that porch in days, maybe weeks. Time had become slippery, measured not in minutes, but in aches. 4 years. That was how long it had been since Michael vanished into the Adira Mountains. She still made 2 cups of coffee each morning. One always went untouched. The scrape of ceramic on wood echoed as she set the second mug in its usual spot. Left side of the table, always the left. Her fingers lingered there, as if holding something invisible. Then, she turned away. Grief had carved quiet routines into her bones. But today, the silence broke. A soft sound, almost nothing, but enough to make her freeze mid-step. Not wind, not a branch creaking, something heavier, intentional. She approached the door, heartbeat ticking faster with every step. The creak of the floorboards sounded unnaturally loud beneath her socks. She placed one hand on the doorknob, the other gripping the frame as though to steady herself against something not yet seen. Through the mist, a shape took form. A large dog stood at the bottom of her porch steps. Its coat was matted, gray-brown, streaked with mud and thorn scratches. The animal didn't look lost or afraid. It looked resolved. Ellie didn't speak at first. She simply stared. Then she saw what it held in its mouth. A jacket. Blue. Worn. Faded, but unmistakable. Her breath caught, and the mug slipped from her hand. It shattered against the floor, but the sound barely registered. Her eyes were locked on the jacket. Michael's jacket. She hadn't seen it since the day he left. She remembered how he'd zipped it up with a smile, said something dumb about finishing the chicken soup without him. That morning, now fossilized in memory, shattered through her in one jagged rush. Her knees nearly gave out. The dog stepped forward, just once, then sat. The jacket dropped to the damp porch boards like a relic, like an offering. Ellie opened the door. Cold mist rushed in, clinging to her skin, her breath, her grief. And there it was, the beginning of something she hadn't dared let herself believe in anymore. Not hope, not yet, but movement, a shift, a dog who had crossed storms and silence to reach her. And in its eyes, something older than words, purpose. Ellie stepped barefoot onto the porch, the wooden planks cold beneath her feet. The wind curled around her legs like an old sorrow, sharp and damp. She couldn't take her eyes off the dog. It didn't flinch, didn't bark, just watched her. "Hello there." Her voice cracked, raw from disuse and disbelief. The dog didn't move. She bent down slowly, knees stiff from years of grief held inside. The jacket lay at her feet like a ghost, mud-spattered, torn at one shoulder, but whole. Her fingers hovered over it, afraid it might vanish if touched. Then she grasped it. The cold fabric soaked into her palms. She clutched it to her chest. Her breath hitched, chest rising in shallow bursts. It still smelled like the mountains, pine, rain, something mineral, and beneath it all, the faintest trace of sandalwood. Michael's scent. A sob rose unbidden, muffled against the fabric. She sank onto the steps, the jacket wrapped in her arms, and let herself fall into memory. The last morning, his laugh, the zipper stuck at the collar. "Back before dinner," he said. "Don't eat all the soup." His kiss on her forehead, gone before the fog lifted. Now the fog had returned, but it brought something back. The dog padded forward silently. It stopped just beside her and sat again, gaze steady. She glanced sideways at it, studying its body. Ribs too prominent, paws scraped raw, a long scar healed poorly along its front leg. And yet it held itself with a strange dignity. A collar clung to its neck. Old leather. The tag was gone, but it told a story anyway, of belonging, of being lost, maybe of waiting. Ellie extended a hand. The dog didn't move for a moment. Then it leaned in, pressing its head softly against her fingers. Warm, solid, real. She exhaled like a tide releasing from shore. "You came a long way, didn't you?" she whispered. The dog wagged its tail. Just once. It was so slight, so hesitant, it nearly broke her. Something inside her, long shut, long buried, tugged awake. Not just the jacket, not just the scent, but this creature, this messenger, this presence that had crossed miles of unknown wild to find her. Why? How? Her hand rested on its head now, fingers tangled in wet fur. She didn't need to ask anything. The silence between them was enough. Maybe she wasn't alone anymore. Maybe the story wasn't over. That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. The fire had long since burned down to a faint orange breath in the hearth. She sat cross-legged on the floor, the jacket folded in her lap like something sacred. Bruno. The name had slipped out of her lips without thought, as if it had always belonged to him. Lay curled at the foot of the sofa, his deep amber eyes open, watching her in the quiet. He hadn't left her side since she opened the door. She'd given him a blanket, a bowl of water, a few scraps of leftover roast chicken. He hadn't touched the meat right away. Instead, he'd nudged the bowl aside and simply sat with her, his quiet presence more grounding than anything she'd felt in years. Now, in the flickering half-dark, Ellie turned the jacket over in her hands again. Her fingers brushed along the inner seam, and something crinkled. Her breath caught. She reached into the small chest pocket. There, nestled deep beneath layers of dried mud and time, was a thin slip of paper, creased, fragile, soft at the edges like it had weathered storms. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. Words smudged. Ink bled. But a single line remained clear. "My dearest Ellie, I love you forever." The rest had faded into ghost text, only fragments visible, like breath on glass. Got lost, cave system, if you're reading this. A plea maybe, a warning, a goodbye that had never been delivered. She pressed the note against her chest. Bruno stirred. He stood and crossed the room without a sound, his movements fluid, his paws quiet on the floorboards. He nuzzled her shoulder gently, then curled beside her, his flank warm against her thigh. Ellie leaned into him. The jacket, the note, the dog. None of it made sense. And yet, something deep in her marrow whispered that it was real, that it mattered. Bruno licked her hand, one slow, deliberate motion, and laid his head in her lap. For the first time in years, Ellie closed her eyes and didn't see the void. She saw a path, faint, winding, but waiting. Morning crept slowly through the fog-streaked windows, pale and colorless. Ellie hadn't moved from the living room floor. She had drifted into sleep at some point, the jacket still clutched to her chest, her head resting gently against Bruno's warm body. It was the first night in 4 years she hadn't dreamed of an empty trail. Bruno stirred beneath her. His breath rose and fell in quiet rhythm, steady as a metronome. She sat up slowly, bones stiff, heart tender. For a moment, the heaviness in her chest was softer. Not gone, but thinner, as though grief had finally blinked. Outside, the world was still soaked in gray. But something had shifted. She rose and placed the jacket on the table. The note remained tucked inside, now sealed in a clear bag. Her fingers hovered over it. She couldn't bring herself to read it again. Not yet. The words echoed in her memory, and that was enough. Bruno padded into the kitchen, nose twitching as he sniffed along the floorboards. When Ellie opened the pantry, he sat patiently beside her, watching, waiting, not begging, not barking, just present. She tore a small piece of bread, dipped it in warm broth, and held it out in her hand. Bruno didn't take it right away. His amber eyes met hers, and something passed between them. Caution, trust, memory, perhaps. Then, slowly, he leaned forward and took the food from her palm. His mouth was soft, his touch gentle. That was the moment it happened. Not the arrival, not the note, not the jacket, but this. Food accepted, an opening. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. A knot of tears tried to rise, but she blinked them back. "You're not just lost, are you?" she whispered. "You were sent." Bruno tilted his head. The silence between them felt like a vow. Outside, the wind picked up. The mountains, distant and veiled, whispered through the branches. Ellie turned back to the jacket. She ran her hand along the collar, brushing off flecks of dried earth. Then she noticed something new. Beneath the mud, in the tiny inner seam, a single thread had come loose, and with it, a familiar smell rose faintly from the fabric. Sandalwood. Michael's cologne. Ellie pressed the jacket to her face, breathing in deeply, and for one flickering moment, it was as if he stood beside her. "Come back to me," she whispered, not to the air, but to something deeper, to memory, to possibility, to whatever force had brought this dog to her door. Bruno lay at her feet. He didn't wag. He didn't move. He simply stayed. And that was more than enough. The phone felt heavier than Ellie remembered. Her fingers hovered over the worn numbers, hesitating as if dialing might shatter. Whatever fragile thing had begun to grow inside her. She finally pressed the last digit. 4 rings. Then, "Eleanor?" A voice, gravel thick and steady. Peter Walker, the former inspector who had led the initial search party. She tried to answer, but the words caught in her throat. When they finally came, they cracked like dry leaves. "Peter, I found something." Silence, then the shift in his voice. "Talk to me." "A dog came to my door yesterday. He brought Michael's jacket." Another pause. No disbelief, only the sound of breathing and boots scraping the floor. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Peter said. "Don't touch anything else." True to his word, the familiar rumble of Peter's old pickup truck arrived just past the edge of the fog. Ellie waited on the porch, Bruno beside her like a silent sentinel. Peter stepped out slowly. His gait was a little stiff, his right leg dragging slightly from an old injury he'd never bothered to treat properly. But his eyes were the same as they had been 4 years ago. Sharp, unwavering, burdened with too many unsolved endings. The moment he saw Bruno, he stopped mid-step. "Well now," he muttered, kneeling despite the pain. He extended a weathered hand, palm up. "You're not just any stray, are you?" Bruno stepped forward, lowered his head, and pressed his brow into Peter's hand. Peter's mouth parted slightly, a reverent breath escaping. "It can't be." Inside, Peter laid the jacket flat across the kitchen table, every fold treated like evidence. Bruno sat near Ellie's feet, tail curled, gaze locked on the jacket. Peter examined it carefully. Shoulders, seams, collar. He sniffed the faint scent, rubbed the mud between his fingers. "This hasn't been in the wild for 4 years," he murmured. "Maybe 1, maybe less." Ellie's heart skipped. Peter turned the jacket inside out, inspecting the lining, zippers, and stitching. "If this was left in the woods all that time, we'd see damage, Moldavian fraying, sun bleaching, but it's intact. He picked up a flashlight and examined the mud. Still damp, reddish, highland soil. This is fresh. Ellie clutched the edge of the table. Her world swayed. Michael might have been alive far more recently than we thought, Peter said softly. Bruno shifted closer, pressing his side against Ellie's calf. The warmth of him anchored her to the moment. "What do we do?" she asked, voice barely more than a breath. Peter looked from her to the dog. "We follow," he said, and Bruno stood up. By the time they stepped off the porch, the sky had darkened, not with rain, but with the heavy weight of waiting. Bruno led, not in a rush, not aimlessly, with certainty. Ellie followed, her boots crunching on old gravel and mossy roots, her heart thudding louder than her steps. Peter walked behind, quietly marking trees with neon fabric strips, small blazes in case they had to retrace their path. The deeper they went, the more the forest changed. Light dimmed. Branches closed in like ribs. The air thickened with pine resin and damp stone. Every sound felt louder, footsteps, snapping twigs, the occasional echo of wind weaving through the trees. But Bruno never hesitated. He moved with grace, nose low, tail steady. At one point, Ellie faltered, nearly stumbling over a slick rock. Bruno paused, turned, and waited until her balance returned. His eyes met hers. No urgency, only quiet trust. It wasn't just instinct. He knew something. Hours passed before Bruno slowed. They had reached a small clearing, where the trees opened into a slope of soft earth. Bruno stepped to the edge, nose twitching. Then he pawed at the ground, twice, then stopped. Peter joined him, crouching low. "Dig marks," he said. "Old, but not too old. Like someone cleared a space. Maybe rested here." Ellie dropped to her knees beside him. Her hand brushed the soil and found a flattened patch, just wide enough for a body to have lain curled in the cold. She imagined Michael here, exhausted, wrapped in his jacket, waiting for dawn, or for rescue, or for the courage to move forward. Beside her, Bruno whimpered softly. Peter's face hardened. He was here. Ellie's breath caught. She closed her eyes and pressed her palm into the earth, as if it could remember. Then, Bruno raised his head sharply, ears alert, and took off, not with panic, with purpose. "Wait, Bruno!" Ellie shouted, scrambling after him. Peter followed without question. They ran. Through the underbrush, over slick moss, across shallow stream beds. Bruno never veered, never paused, until he stopped, at a split in the path. Two narrow trails veering in different directions. Bruno stood between them, his body tense, his tail still. Ellie reached him, panting. She placed a hand on his back. "What is it? Which way?" Bruno turned his head. His gaze flicked to the left trail, then back to Ellie, and waited, for her to choose. Ellie looked down both paths, one darker, thicker with vines, the other clearer, sloping uphill. The ache in her chest returned, but not from fear, from knowing. This wasn't just a search. It was a beginning. She stepped toward the darker path. Bruno followed without sound. Peter said nothing, just nodded and walked behind. As they vanished beneath the canopy, the wind rose behind them, rustling the trees like a voice too old to speak, whispering, "Keep going." They returned to the house just after dusk. The sky was bleeding amber behind the peaks, the last glow of day casting long, slanted shadows across the porch. Ellie stood on the steps with the jacket pressed against her chest, its fabric still damp from the mountain air. Bruno lay at her feet, silent, motionless, but not asleep. His eyes never left the woods behind them. Inside, the house felt different, not warmer, not safer, just thinner. like the walls knew what had shifted. Ellie barely had time to gather her breath before she heard the car. Gravel crunched, tires turned. A silver SUV. David. Her heart clenched. He stepped out slowly. Michael's older brother. Solid frame, deep-lined face, eyes that had carried the same grief, but had learned to mask it better. "Ellie," he said as he walked toward her, "we need to talk." Bruno rose to a stand, positioning himself half a step ahead of her, his gaze locked on David. Not aggressive, just protective. David ignored him. "I heard from someone in town you'd called Peter, that something came up." Ellie said nothing. "You've suffered enough," David continued, stopping a few feet away. "I know you loved Michael more than anything, but it's been 4 years." She didn't flinch. 4 years of searching, of hoping. "You've been strong, Ellie, but it's time to let go." Her fingers clenched around the jacket. "I found this," she said softly, holding it up. "Yesterday." David's eyes fell on the jacket, then back to hers. "It hasn't been outside for 4 years, Ellie added. "The fabric, the scent. It's been kept. Protected. That means something." David took a breath and stepped closer. "Or it means nothing. A coincidence. A trick your mind's playing." Bruno's ears pinned back. "It's not just the jacket," she said. "There's a note, Michael's handwriting. He was alive longer than we thought." David's expression shifted, uncertainty, then pain. "Ellie," he said, his voice lowering, "sometimes what we find, it's just grief trying to make sense of the silence." His words sliced through her, precise, gentle, but cruel all the same. She didn't reply, but Bruno did. He whined, a soft, mournful sound that cut through the air. David glanced down at him, then stepped back, a sigh escaping his chest. Ellie turned away. "I'm not letting go." David nodded slowly. "Then I hope you find what you're looking for." He walked back to the car. The door slammed, the engine started, and then he was gone. Bruno sat beside her again, and Ellie, her eyes full but dry, whispered to the empty wind, "I don't need them to believe me." Ellie didn't go inside right away. She stood on the porch long after the taillights disappeared down the gravel road, the night pressing in around her like a second skin. Bruno stayed by her side, still and watchful, as if waiting for the hurt to quiet. She thought she was past this, past the pitying looks, the hushed whispers, the gentle suggestions to move on. But David's words had opened something raw. Not doubt. Not truly. Just that familiar ache, that heavy voice inside that whispered, "What if they're right? What if you're just chasing a ghost?" The screen door creaked open behind her. "Ellie." It was Sarah. She hurried down the steps barefoot, her cardigan slipping off one shoulder. Her eyes were wide with worry, but her hands were already reaching out, steady, warm. Sarah had been Ellie's closest friend since college. She didn't ask questions, didn't wait for an invitation. She just wrapped Ellie in a fierce hug and held on. "You don't have to explain," Sarah said. "I know." Ellie's shoulders trembled. She didn't cry, but she leaned in, burying her face in the crook of her friend's shoulder. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know." "What if I'm wrong?" Sarah pulled back just enough to meet her gaze. "And what if you're not?" Ellie looked down at Bruno. He met her eyes, unwavering, loyal, certain. Sarah followed her gaze. "He brought you something real. That jacket, that note. He came for a reason." "He's more than a dog," Ellie said quietly. Sarah nodded. "Then follow him." The wind picked up around them, swirling leaves across the porch. Somewhere deep in the woods, an owl called once, low and long. Sarah reached out, took Ellie's hand, and squeezed. The people who truly love you won't ask you to stop. They'll walk beside you, even if the road is dark. Ellie felt her chest tighten again, but this time, not from grief, from resolve. She turned to Bruno. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "we keep going." Bruno's tail moved, just slightly, a quiet agreement. Sarah looked at them both and smiled. "You're not alone, Ellie. You never were." And in that moment, for the first time in 4 years, Ellie believed it. The forest greeted them like an old sentinel, silent, watchful, vast. Ellie zipped her coat up to her chin, the old compass tucked safely into her pocket, and followed closely behind Bruno. Peter walked a few paces back, his hiking staff striking rhythm against the earth. Above, clouds rolled in, thick and slate gray, and the mountain wind whispered warnings through the high branches. The three of them stepped into the tree line, leaving behind the house and the doubts. It wasn't just a search now, it was a pilgrimage. Bruno led without hesitation. His paws moved with muscle memory, as if retracing a route carved deep into his being. The path twisted through gnarled roots and slippery stones. Dead leaves clung to Ellie's boots, and the deeper they went, the more the light faded into a pale, storm-heavy dusk. Then came the rain. It started as mist, then needles, then a curtain of icy sheets, slashing sideways across their bodies. Ellie pulled her hood tight. Water soaked through her sleeves, and yet she didn't stop. Bruno's fur darkened with rain, his tail lowered, but still moving. His ears remained sharp, eyes scanning. Hours passed. Then Bruno froze. Peter caught up just as Ellie stilled behind the dog. Bruno crouched low, his nose to the earth. Footprints pressed deep into the mud, still sharp around the edges, not yet softened by rain. Ellie dropped to her knees. She traced the print with her fingers. Her chest tightened. Michael. She would have known his stride anywhere. A few steps further, draped over a fallen log, was a coil of red climbing rope. Raindrops clung to it like tiny stars, refracting every trace of hope that surged through her. Peter picked it up carefully. "Still warm to the touch," he murmured. "Someone passed through here not long ago." Ellie held the rope to her chest like a lifeline. Bruno stepped forward again, slowly now, focused. He led them through a narrow ravine, half hidden by low-hanging branches, until he stopped at what looked like nothing more than a cluster of boulders. But beneath them, veiled in vines and moss, was a crack. A breath of air flowed from it, cool and metallic, the scent of stone and rust and something older than time. A cave. Ellie's heart hammered. Bruno stared into the darkness, waiting. Peter pulled out rope from his pack and began securing an anchor around a tree. "You sure about this?" he asked. Ellie stepped beside Bruno and knelt. She looked into his amber eyes. He looked back. And then she whispered, "We're not turning back." The rope descended into silence. Ellie gripped it tightly, her breath shallow. The cave's mouth yawned before her like an old wound, wrapped in shadow and mist. Bruno was the first to move. Without waiting, he lowered himself into the narrow opening, his form disappearing into the earth like a whispered promise. Ellie followed. The cold swallowed her. The air inside was dense with the scent of wet rock, ancient minerals, and something faintly electric, like ozone, clinging to the aftermath of a storm. Every drop of water that fell from the ceiling echoed like a drumbeat against stone. Peter descended last, his flashlight cutting lines through the black. Inside, it felt as though time had slowed to a crawl. Bruno led through narrow passages, his steps unerring. The cave twisted like a labyrinth, deeper and darker with every turn. At one point, Ellie paused to catch her breath, pressing her palm to the damp wall. Her fingers grazed something smooth, worn, a handprint, small, human, set into the limestone as if someone had steadied themselves in the same place. She didn't speak, didn't dare. Bruno moved again. It was hours, or perhaps only minutes, before the tunnel opened slightly, revealing a hollow, lit by the flicker of dying firelight. Ellie froze. In the corner sat a battered old radio, its signal flickering like a heartbeat. A soft, crackling hum escaped its speaker, and then, faintly, a voice. Louis Armstrong's "What a Wonderful World." Her knees buckled. She crawled to the radio, her hands shaking. A note was pinned beneath it, held down with a rusted knife. "If you found this, it means you didn't give up. I'm still waiting for you." The paper blurred as her tears fell. Bruno stepped close and rested his head gently on her lap. Peter stood nearby, silent, reverent. There were no questions, no disbelief, only the sacred hush of realization. Michael had been here, might still be. Ellie cradled the note against her chest. In her mind, she saw his hands writing it, hurried, desperate, but full of hope. Bruno looked up at her. No bark, no movement, just his eyes, wide, deep, waiting. Ellie nodded slowly. "We keep going," she whispered, "all the way." The radio's final note faded into silence, but its echo lingered in Ellie's chest like a heartbeat she thought she'd forgotten how to follow. They pressed deeper into the mountain's veins. Bruno led with quiet purpose, his paws skimming over uneven stone, ears alert for sounds no human ear could catch. Peter followed, flashlight sweeping in wide arcs, mapping every ridge and shadow. Ellie came last, one hand brushing the rock wall, the other clutching Michael's note, creased and damp but unyielding. The cave narrowed, then widened again into an unexpected space, a dome of carved stone and darkness pierced by glimmers of metallic equipment. The light from their flashlights swept across a collapsed cot, a half-burned fire pit, and a tent set against the wall, old but intact. A camp, still standing. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. She stepped closer, her flashlight catching on an object near the tent flap. A tin cup. The rim still held the faintest trace of warmth. Bruno padded to the center of the camp, nose sweeping the ground. Then he stopped. A map lay pinned under a smooth stone, rough-drawn lines tracing the tunnels ahead. One point had been marked in red. The gateway. Peter crouched, his hand brushing over geological tools, pages of handwritten notes, sketches of minerals, radiation levels, magnetic field distortions. "He was researching something," Peter murmured. "Something big." Ellie opened one of the notebooks, her breath trembling. Michael's handwriting, unmistakable. Scrawled across the page was a single line underlined in red. "Ellie must know. If I don't make it, Bruno will." She dropped to her knees. Bruno sat beside her, still and solemn, as if he had waited his whole life for her to read those words. She turned to him, tears slipping down her face. "You kept his promise," she whispered, "all this time." Bruno wagged his tail, once. Then the silence cracked, the sound of gravel underfoot. 3 figures emerged from the shadows, their shapes solidifying in the pale beam of Peter's flashlight. Men, faces cloaked in dirt and intent. The one in front stepped forward. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. Peter moved between them and Ellie, staff clenched, shoulders square. Bruno did the same. The man's eyes narrowed. "Turn around. Now." But Ellie didn't move. She looked at Bruno and waited. The man stepped forward again. Ellie stood slowly, the note still in her hand, her heart thudding like thunder in the walls of her chest. "We're not leaving," she said, voice low but steady. "We're looking for Michael Carter." The man's jaw tightened. He knew things he shouldn't. That mineral, what he found in this cave, wasn't meant to be public. If you go any farther, you'll never leave. Bruno let out a low growl. Not loud, just deep enough to still the air. Peter didn't flinch. He shifted his stance, planting his hiking staff like a boundary in the stone. "We're not afraid of truth," Peter said. The standoff lingered like smoke in the cavern. Then, from behind the trio, a voice, clear, urgent. "Wait!" Everyone turned. A figure stepped out of the darker tunnel behind them. Lean, beard unkempt, eyes sunken but blazing. Michael. Ellie's breath left her in a single word. Michael. His steps faltered, but he kept walking. Bruno broke into a trot and reached him first, circling, pressing his head into Michael's thigh. Michael dropped to his knees and pulled the dog into his arms. "I knew you'd bring her," he whispered. "I told you to." Ellie couldn't move. Michael looked up at her, face soaked in sweat and dust and something more powerful than either. Relief. "I left the notes. I left the rope. I sent Bruno. I knew it was the only way." She ran to him, their arms locked tight. No sound, just skin, heat, and 4 years collapsing into a single breath. Peter kept his eyes on the 3 men, who now stood frozen, somewhere between stunned and shattered. "No one's leaving with the mineral," Michael said, standing slowly. "It's unstable, dangerous. But the truth, that belongs to her." He looked at Ellie. "She's the reason I kept going." Ellie reached for his hand, fingers intertwining. Bruno sat at their feet, his gaze soft, his body finally relaxed. The storm outside was still raging, but here, deep beneath the mountain's weight, something had cracked open. A future.